Harini, are you ready to go live?
Yes, I'm going live and I have also asked for the phone number. I will share it with you in a few minutes. We are live.
Okay. Well, thank you, Harini. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our speakers and a warm welcome also to our audience to this webinar, which is entitled Existential Risk Governance in Turbulent Times, and asking, are we witnessing a descent into prolonged geopolitical disorder, or are these the birth pangs of a new planetary order? The webinar is organized by Extra, an initiative of the World Academy of Arts and Science that I'm chairing. The task we have set ourselves in Extra is to monitor global existential threats and the threat reporting landscape, and to provide decision and policymakers and anyone else who's interested with a condensed and constantly updated summary of what the risk community collectively knows about the major X risks of our times and their systemic interactions also. We do this in a strictly impartial manner that is partisan only to the future of humanity as a whole. The connection to today's webinar theme of geopolitical instability is rather obvious. While this webinar was scheduled before the war in Iran, we had already anticipated more trouble. A trend towards greater instability was much discussed in the risk report sector in the World Economic Forum risk report, for example, and we amplified that message at the time. But a very serious Middle East crisis has since arisen following the Israel-US attack on Iran and the assassination of its leadership and ongoing escalation. Today, we hope to bring some clarity into the chaos of the ever more shocking news that reaches us every day, and hopefully cut through some of the rather heavy wartime propaganda. The aim is to better understand the broader political trends that are driving this and other conflicts in today's increasingly multipolar world, a word that means different things to different people. Our very experienced expert speakers will provide a context in which this and other conflicts may just start to make some sense. Of course, our primary concern are the X-risk implications of all this, both in the short and long term. Clearly, we do have a scenario here from which a third world war or nuclear attack could arise. We have an energy crisis of unprecedented proportions, according to the IEA, that could lead on to a food crisis, an inflation and debt crisis, and could trigger a global economic and financial meltdown if the conflict continues. This is an existential risk of the first order in itself, but it also has a severe impact on global multilateral cooperation, on climate change and other X risks. So I'm now handing over to our outreach officer in Extra, Anna Maria Parshiv, to introduce the speakers. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our guest today. So I will start by my dear friend, Sanjoy Joshi, that is the chairman and the director of the Observer Research Foundation, India leading think tank on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Also, the Observer Research Foundation is doing every year the conference called Raisina Dialogue, one of the most beautiful and interesting conference, in my opinion, from around the world, and especially right now. They had a very brilliant conference that I never saw in my life. He's a former senior officer in the Indian Administrative Service. He brings over 25 years experience in energy environment policy. He has a deep knowledge of risk and geopolitical uphill associated with the momentous transition from the fossil fuels to renewable currently underway. So Sanjoy will reflect on the extent to which energy is a driver in the current geopolitical competition and turmoil. So please welcome Sanjoy. Our next speaker is again another good friend, Professor Renato Flores, director of the FGV International Intelligence Unity in Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, professor of APG Graduate School of Economics, also a trustee of the Brazilian Center for International Relations. He had advised governments, international organizations, and private business worldwide, and he will speak from a Brazilian and BRICS perspective. He will address the future of US dollar and the risk of the new Monroe Doctrine. Please welcome Renato. And the next speaker, a good friend also, Velina Chakarova, the founder of the Face for a Conscious Experience. He is a former director of the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy in Vienna. She's an Austrian-Bulgarian geopolitical strategist and political scientist. Her work focuses on strategic geopolitics, on global system transformation, and European security, and she will speak on the Dragon Bear alliance between China and Russia and the destabilization of Atlantic Alliance. Please welcome to Velina.
Okay.
And we are honored also to welcome Donato Kinger Pasigli, Vice President of World Academy of Arts and Science, the head of Academy of Global Peace Offensive. He's also former senior official of United Nations with over 35 years experience. He has authored papers on challenges and solutions for global security. And speaking today from the UN office in Geneva, he will address the current instability from a multilateral perspective. And he will consider what the role United Nations may play or may not play in emerging multipolar order, and he will examine the prospects for peace, the rule of law, and effective global risk governance. Please welcome also Donato. And last but not least, I hope he's already here, Donato Granov, the president of Global Security Institute, an international expert in global security, peace building, and international law. He brings a strong civil society perspective to our discussion, and he will reflect on the risk of the nuclear and other major confrontation. He's also a leader in the US legal profession, the Bar Association, and he will speak to how the global instability connect to his country's own internal struggles. Thank you so much, Thomas. Over you.
Thank you, Anna, for these introductions. And we have a wonderful lineup. I'm very proud to be able to introduce such a wonderful panel. Now, first of all, I'll start with Sanjoy, and I'm going to draw a little bit on your expertise in the oil and gas sector, and you have a deep knowledge of that. And I'm wondering, do you think this is another war for oil, sort of coming after the events in Venezuela? Also, Greenland, which is about resources, not oil, but other resources. Is it a resources war? And how much sense does this make in today's day and age, as we're trying to transition to renewables? China's leading the charge there. How is that maybe even the reason why this sort of disruption has been created? How do you see the sort of strategic importance of energy in all this?
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you for the question. Thank you, Anna, for getting me here. To respond to you, Thomas, let me talk about the overall theme, existential risk. You see, the place where we find ourselves today, particularly at this point of time, is, if you were to give an analogy, I'll use it from the world of computers. It's the old operating system is crashing. It's not only crashing, I think it's crashed already. The trouble is, and the bad news is, that we are not ready to write the new one yet. And we are running all critical systems on a failing and a flailing platform. So much of the disorder you see around you is partly arises from that kind of situation. And the signs of that failure is not that it started suddenly, either with the closing of the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, that is making the headlines today. Very, very important. I've been following that incident very closely in the last 2 weeks. So every minute the news changes, the news line changes. But you can go back. You can go back to the Ukraine war. You can go back even further than that. in many ways, the fight for resources, you asked that question, is this a fight for resources? See, the fight for resources has been always there. I mean, even the Second World War was really a fight for energy and who controls energy and energy resources. It really became a battle for who controlled the oil from the Middle East and West Asia. And that is how the terms of the Second World War were settled, and you had the whole system come into place. But I don't want to get into that history at all. Looking at this particular point of time, the Straits of Hormuz crisis, yes, in a way, is about oil, but more important than that, it is becoming something which is where oil is only becoming one of the side shows, oil and gas. Energy is also becoming one of the side shows. There are much larger events around this. Who is most affected? I think everyone is most affected. The short version would be that, we can start looking at the immediate pressure points, that the global south is going to be greatly affected. The first dominoes to fall in this probably will be parts of the world where I am residing, where when you start looking at the vulnerability index, because of the supply chains and the dependence on the Straits of Hormuz and the Gulf, you will start saying, okay, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, badly hit. They're going to be hit on fertilizers. They're going to be hit on food after some time. A lot of things are going to happen. But this is not just something which is going to remain localized. I think very soon and already you will find that the global north discovers it's also equally vulnerable. It's equally vulnerable because when the supply chains are getting affected, it is not just oil and gas which is getting hit. What is getting hit is fertilizer, food production. Beyond that, even things like, polypropylene, things like plastics, things like helium. Helium is central today to the entire fourth industrial revolution. There's a huge 30% of helium supply is getting hit with the closure of the Straits of Hormuz because Qatar has been hit. So there are some parts of this which are not going to be very easily replaced. And as far as energy is concerned, a lot of things have been happening in the field of energy even before the Hormuz crisis struck. One of the things which has been happening is that today, not just today, but I think 4 or 5 years ago, we started realizing that maybe the Paris Accord was written for another world in a different time. It was not written for this world because the consensus which we'd agreed on in Paris had broken down by the time even the first Trump administration came in. There were questions about it. And when the second time Trump came in, the first act was to not just withdraw from the climate accord again, but also see what followed was that the biggest corporations, banks in America and Canada actually withdrew from net zero alliances. So yes, there was a major disruption happening on the climate front. It's not that others abandoned climate change because lots of people already have heavily invested in the supply chains of renewable energy. There's a huge momentum. And that momentum is not going to end just because one country or the other backs out of it. So where do we go from here? How do things move is actually a question which we can discuss for, till the cows come home. But I really think that the shift which is happening is far more fundamental. The old order has kind of lost legitimacy. The old order also consists of how markets operate, how risk operates. And if you ask me as an energy expert, you said you called me as an energy expert. Today, there is no energy expert. I've been kind of looking at all the good analysis coming out from the professional energy and traditional fossil fuel energy companies, which is everyday talk about with the world of energy. They are themselves flummoxed. They do not know where this is really headed. The model is so broken. On the one hand, we've been talking about, a kind of economic model which is passing, which is going away. And what is this economic model? This economic model is really about, a consumption-based economic model, which was fueled by energy in a large part, and which was fundamentally based on how much you can consume and how much does the GDP grow from year to year. Now, that is, I would say, a certain ethic which came behind it, which was a very high energy consumption ethic. And energy consumption would continue to grow. as the fourth industrial revolution comes, you now find that maybe the demands of energy, because as a result of that revolution, are going to expand even more exponentially. Because with the growth in data centers, with the growth in robotics, demands on energy are going to rise even as we become far more efficient. So we were getting into this spiral, and the spiral keeps on extending outwards to a point of complete chaos, disorder, and confusion. So when that question arises, are we in a place of reset? Are we approaching reset? I think in many ways, yes, we are approaching reset, because we are really reaching a point where you have to start getting all these things integrated again. The spiral is just completely going out of control. Now, what is going to bring it back? Is it going to be a big war again? Or are we going to step back from the brink and realize and understand? And this is precisely where the conflict is headed today at this point of view. The headlines which you are seeing are primarily about that escalation cycle. The ladder of escalation just keeps on mounting and mounting and mounting. Both sides are in a situation where none is prepared to blink. None is prepared to step back from where they are. Every day you're getting, every minute, in fact, you're getting news saying, are they climbing up? Are they climbing down? And if you start looking at the way the narrative is being built, actually the narrative which is coming out from President Trump actually looks a weak narrative. It's a weak narrative because there are too many lies in it. Every day it changes.
Yeah.
The narrative coming from the other side actually starts looking more convincing. So it's a very dangerous place we are headed for at this point of time. So
Sanjoy,
where do we
I just
step
wanted
back from this is going to be the big question which we will have to debate. And what causes us to go back? That is a big question. And I'll come back again on this. I don't want to take too long. But I think the future really lies in another direction, where we start seeing as to how are young people in the world responding to what they are seeing around. And there's a big difference. And that is where the whole story about who is telling what stories, who is believing what stories becomes very, very important. And that is where I see the shifts really happening. Thank you.
Sanjoy, just in a sentence or two, I wanted to ask you specifically about India as an example, because India has been wavering quite a bit. It's a member of BRICS, a very prominent members. It's also, made some overtures towards Israel, the visit by Modi to Israel, which was a little bit surprising even to insiders in India. And then, of course, the question of Russian oil and all the long-standing relationship with Russia, the rivalry with China. I think India is actually quite exemplary, because many countries, Australia, where I live also, every country really is confronted with these impossible choices. How would you summarize the Indian take on this situation, or the
See, India's
response?
take is actually more I would say, a very different civilizational take on the situation which is around you. And that take is really where it comes from is, we believe in cycles of time. We believe that that time moves through cycles of integration and disintegration.
Kali
And
Yuga.
not yes, but more important, yoga at the strategic level, even at the global level, that you go through these phases, and to try and pinpoint a particular phase and paint it in terms of a very binary world order, saying A is good and B is bad, and this one is a devil and this one is a saint, and you have to pick sides. We do not believe in that. We believe that each part has its uses. No, we go back to our mythology, we go back to how the world order, how we conceive it, that yes, creation and destruction are really part of the same cycle. That every cycle of destruction creates a new. And at
That's an
some point of
interesting.
time, the old order, yes, needs to destroy itself and create a new order. And it is not that one is wrong and one is right. It is like the centripetal, the centrifugal forces balancing each other. So we believe in that balance between the two. We keep on trying to bring the two. And that is why we believe that it is important that there must be someone who gets two sides to talk to each other, two opposite sides to talk to each other, because in many ways, both are right, in many ways, both are wrong.
That's very
And they
interesting.
have to meet somewhere in between.
Interesting contrast to the sort of eschatological ideas in certain circles in Israel and also in the United States, in the sort of fundamentalist Christian circles, where you have this idea that you know, of an end time, a total final cataclysm. I hope we are not heading for that anyway. But let me now turn to Renato, who can give us a perspective from Brazil, another very prominent founding member of BRICS and a part of, you know, and I think Brazil is very important player also in South America, being the most prominent, foremost largest country in South America. Renato, what is your perspective on this? Your background is in finance and trade, and I was wondering how much of this has to do with we said before, you know, petroleum, but also the petroleum dollar. You know, the whole idea of de-dollarization that has been put forward by BRICS and that has apparently really quite scared the Americans and seen as a hostile rather than a balancing act. What's the perspective from Brazil, you know, watching somewhat from the sidelines this conflict?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'll be very basic, very simple, very straightforward. I'll start with two general points. We are living very, very dangerous times. I would guess that the probability of a world war, a devastating world war, has reached about 70 to 80% of probability. It's higher than 5%, much higher than 1% at least, which is the tolerable probability. This is a serious point. Second point is that we have a very serious situation internationally regarding the United Nations. The United Nations is a failed institution. The Security Council is, let us be diplomatic, very debatable decision-making group. And we have a problem because the United Nations was the pillar of security and of world order in the post-World War II world. So we have to cope with the absence of a peacemaker which would have the support of all the world. That's serious. And thirdly, while we're talking here, people are being killed, homes are being destroyed, children are dying, hospitals are being bombed everywhere. That's not nice, and we must do something. So this is my introduction. Within this context, I think that BRICS has a role. We have 11 members, and we have 9 partners. Partners are supposed to become members. So we have about 20 countries spread all over the planet. And this can be a very important forum. However, BRICS has always been a very peculiar forum, and it must evolve within this peculiar dimension, which in my view, in Brazil's view, in general, is one of our assets. First, we are an informal grouping. So it is not too bureaucratic, and we don't tie the hands of our members. That's very important. We have very diversified members with different policy objectives. Oh, hopefully, we all have a common ground, but we must evolve taking into account that we do not agree on everything. That's a very delicate process. The second is that we are a peaceful organization. We have been a forum where countries, which, as we know, they have disputes between them, but within the BRICS context, they can talk. I give the example of my Indian brothers and my Chinese friends. Within BRICS, they talk, and they talk in a very civilized way, in a very positive way. Now we have Egypt and Ethiopia. We have Saudi Arabia. We have the Emirates. We have Iran. So one of the abilities of the BRICS Forum is to get together all these different animals, and they don't bite each other within BRICS. They try to find a common position whenever it is possible. We must preserve this. We must keep on with this, which is not easy. But given this, and given the seriousness of the present world situation, in which the chairman mentioned about short and long-term effects, we really don't know what's going to happen. We are going to face an enormous inflation. We have an enormous disruption nowadays taking place. And people say, well, let us fight for a new order. No, there is no order. Everybody, in my view, who forecasts or who says he can conceive a new order, I think he's completely wrong. What we are experiencing is the fall. And when a hegemon falls, it takes a long time, and it spreads a lot of hubris, a lot of confusion. So the first point in which I think BRICS must, at ease, we have the Indian presidents this year. It's not going to be an easy year. I sympathize with India in this point. It's going to be a very hard presidency, but I think we must talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is United States. Not that the 20 members are going to find a common position, but we must try to find a few guidelines regarding the hegemon. That's very important. We've just seen the hegemon together with Israel to attack Iran. I'm not going to discuss if Iran is good or bad. I'm not going to discuss the Iranian regime, but it's completely outside the limits of law, even the limits of US law, because the president can only do what was done if there is an immediate threat to the security of the United States, which everybody agrees was not the case. So we must, within BRICS, find a way of living, talking, criticizing. It's not getting away from it, but living with the hegemon. I think this is very, very important. And this is a very hard task. And most of the countries would prefer to avoid this discussion, which I think is a very important discussion. Within this framework, we must move on. We have Iran, which at the time is under threat. We have the Emirates, we are in the Gulf, and we are in a tricky position. We have Saudi Arabia. We have India, which has its own way of conducting foreign affairs. We have China, we have Russia, and down in South America, we have Brazil, where we also have warriors and have our ideas. So the political dimension has invaded BRICS, and we must take care of it. And this year, we must face this very difficult problem. Of course, there is, and very unfortunately, I've watched signs of it. There is a wonderful, and allow me to use the French expression, there is a wonderful fuite à l'avant. The fuite à l'avant, which is grossly translating, is to create new issues that you have to tackle, and this allow you not to discuss the elephant. The fuite à l'avant is to concentrate BRICS on technical solutions. Digital world, resilience, innovation, all this is very important. But this can be a very nice fuite à l'avant. So we must pursue our technical development, our joint. Many times it's bilateral, sometimes it's with 3 countries. For instance, Brazil has a very strong nowadays technical cooperation with Russia. Another country can have with China, India. Also, we are aiming at a very closer technical and scientific cooperation with India. It can be bilateral, it can go BRICS fashion. But this can't be used to neglect the geopolitical discussion. And my final point is that we are powerful. We are powerful because we are exactly diverse, because we think differently. And if a group of people think differently, but give the hands, that's very powerful. And secondly, we are well endowed in resources in different countries. But if you, for instance, if you take oil, Russia is oil and gas wealthy. Brazil is oil wealthy. Also, Saudi Arabia is oil wealthy. If you take critical minerals and rare earths, we have within us a large portion of critical minerals and rare earths. And instead of joining other associations, for instance, for these things, we should create BRICS associations regarding energy inputs and specific and key raw materials. That's very important, and we must do this within BRICS. This will give us leverage, what is very important. Regarding currency, common currency, please, this is a fantasy to have a BRICS common currency, but we must pursue the efforts which have been very successful, which is to diminish the dependence on the US dollar. Nobody wants to end with the use of the US dollar in the world. This is ridiculous also. But we can become more autonomous as we are doing. Iranians now, they said, well, okay, you cross the Strait of Hormuz, which by the way is not closed yet. It's open to many countries. You cross the strait, but you pay in yuan. It's a decision. And this is important because this is a way out of the dollar dependency. So we must continue with measures in this way, not to end, I repeat, with the dollar, but to increase our autonomy as regards international currencies. That's very important. Okay. And finally, we must never forget the importance of peace. In all our narratives, we must have a strong attitude towards peace. Not general state, well, end this war. No, no, no. Each war has its leitmotif, has its origins. General states don't solve anything, but an attitude, constructive, trying to bring back peace according to each specific situation, it's very important. And I think it's another mission that BRICS could successfully performed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renato. That's very helpful. I particularly like your comment on, on the one hand, the hubris, but, as we all know, hubris often conceals an insecurity. And, if you look at the whole narrative of the MAGA movement, it's about American decline, the fear that this decline leads to a catastrophe. But it need not do that. I don't think the world is out to destroy America simply, it's a rebalancing, and there's a sort of, it seems to be a little bit of an overreaction there in on the part of the hegemon. And you're quite right. I mean, there's a lot of talk about de-dollarization, but we're very far from that still, I think, very far. And yeah, it's kind of, there's a certain hysteria around this feeling of decline. But I'm now going to continue and ask Velina to speak about two other BRICS members, and the biggest ones, China and Russia, and their increasing alliance. And talking about fear and hysteria, I think in the American security establishment, from Henry Kissinger to Zbigniew Brzezinski, you had this long-standing idea that the one thing that must be avoided at all costs is a united Eurasia. And that is precisely the project that Russia and China are now envisaging. And Iran is also a part of that. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, I think China invested 480 billion in Iran alone over the last decade, which is massive. So there's clearly, Iran is very much a part of that dream of Eurasian integration, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But from the US perspective of fear of declining empire, it looks bad, but how do Russia and China respond to this disruptive response from the US? How do they see the moment? I mean, we hear a little bit about some of the windfalls that, of course, Russia is getting from the increased oil price, but I don't think anybody is happy about this war. But I know you probably know much better. Please, Velina.
Well,
Oh,
if I
Renato, would
may,
you like to? Yeah, by all means, go ahead.
if I may say something, because I have to leave in about a quarter of an hour. First of all, I wouldn't like to enter into those big theories about hegemonic dreams of Russia, China, and other nations. I think this should deserve a very serious and separated discussion. For instance, I do not think that China wants to dominate the world. That's my view, and we can discuss. I do not think. If you read China's history, you see that they never, and they fear to do this for fear of disaggregation within China itself. So you have a lot. Russia is a broken economy. Russia has no possibility to invade any European country. But of course, there is a narrative that now the old population of Europe, they must become new Hercules or Titans armed with fantastic weapons because they will be a fantastic army. I disagree with this, but I think it's another issue. Maybe should deserve another seminar. What I would like to add is that the point of the fall of a hegemon is a very complex process. We don't know, each process is different. I am looking at the Roman. I think the Roman example is the best one, which took, after falling, it took nearly 100 years to fall. But one very important point is that we also run the risk of an internal split within the hegemon. Let us see what happens in the midterm elections, which is going to be a savage war, maybe not 100% honest. Let us look at the midterm elections and let us look at the reaction of the US population with the developments of this aggression to Iran in terms of prices and all of that. So, coming back to BRICS, we also must discuss and elaborate on the possibility of a disruptor within the hegemon and how we should act. I think this is a further point which is very important. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and you touch on that issue also of the internal destabilization in you know that has been a long time coming in the West. You know the incredible, or I dare say catastrophic rise of inequality, for example, in the wake of neoliberalism and all that. So that's another topic, but it's a major factor. But over to you, Velina. How do you
Thank you
see
very
the
much.
situation there? I'll give
Thank
you
you very
complete
much for the
freedom to
invitation.
how you approach it.
Yeah, I will try to add some points to this highly comprehensive discussion. Obviously, two realities can be simultaneously correct, as we are already observing in the field of quantum physics. And the same goes for the explanations and the different approaches to global affairs, because I argue that there is not one formula that fits all, or let's say one solution that fits all realities. That is why these kind of conversations are so important, because we need to understand, first and foremost, different perspectives based on country background, based on continental background. And then I have to add a very, very peculiar and very specific perspective. That's this will be my 2 cents to the discussion today, which is not land-based. It's not based on my European background or my Eastern European background, but it's actually based on my professional background. That's systems analysis, because my topic that I've been dealing with for the last 2 decades has been global system transformation. And basically, in my case, I want to have the least margin of error in terms of foresight. So my ambition actually is not to present the priorities of one or other country or the priorities of one or other organization, but in reality, my ambition is to be as correct as possible in terms of foresight for what kind of world order is developing, is going to manifest itself, and what kind of actors constellations will be decisive for this new world order. And of course, we can argue we have the two approaches once again simultaneously working, the one being the top-down approach, the other one being the bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach, very important when it comes to the relevance of various countries, especially now in the context of the rise of middle powers. That is why it's so important to have Indian, Brazilian, and other relevant narrations and explanations. But what I will be offering, and this is a really important clarification to manage some expectations here, is the systems, the top-down analysis on a particular relationship, which is China-Russia, and of course what it means for the global order. Now, China-Russia is a very specific relationship. One that, if you remember what historians, political scientists, and IR academics have been telling us for a very, very long time. Remember the debates from 10 years ago, remember the debates from 15 years ago. What was the main narrative? The main narrative was that China and Russia would never, ever come close to each other. Why? Yeah. Because of the realities of this bilateral relationship from the past. So this kind of extrapolation in terms of, let's say, predictive political science, I argue, has not been verified and validated in the case of the relationship between China and Russia. In fact, China and Russia have never been that close in their strategic relations in the whole history of the bilateral relationship, let's say from the last 250 years of industrial revolutions, of global power politics, of hegemonic politics, and so on and so forth. That's first. It's unique. So we are dealing now what I've been describing as a dragon bear at the beginning as a megatrend. It was not a phenomenon that was supposed to define a final outcome. It was just pointing to a megatrend, to a new megatrend that's going to be relevant for global affairs. And when I coined the term 2015, we were at the beginning. Now we are in the next stage of this relationship, which is now the strategic convergence between China and Russia. And when I say strategic convergence, I mean in all systemically relevant domains. So the short definition I have for you is the working definition that I've been applying to this relationship for more than 10 years now, which is a modus operandi. At the beginning, it was a modus vivendi. Now, meanwhile, in the second stage of this relationship, it's modus operandi of strategic coordination between China and Russia in all systemically relevant domains. Full stop. One sentence. Now, apply it to the field of commodities. There you go. Apply, and I can give you plenty of physical examples. Right now, why is China, for instance, even in this precarious situation, still on the winning side short term? I argue that, and I will co-sign and agree with my colleagues who have already covered the ongoing war in Iran. There are no winners in this.
Melina, 1 second. I just would like to say goodbye to Renato, who has to sign off. Renato, thank you so much
Renato,
for being here.
Tune in. Yes, if you want to say, okay.
That's okay. He has to go to the airport. Melina, please continue. Sorry for the interruption.
To give you only one of many examples, what I mean by just using this formula, using this definition to the world of realpolitik and physical reality, even if you take the example of the ongoing war in Iran, you clearly see that China now being in this dragon bear situation, this modus operandi, is still on the winning side short term, next to Russia as the global combined oil and gas producer, as United States as the emerging new global oil and gas producer. So basically the triumvirate of global power right now is on the winning side short term, because in the case of the dragon bear, China can rely on cheap, abundant, and affordable and flowing at every time fossil fuels. That means oil and gas from Russia. But going back to the definition, that means also that China and Russia do not need to sign any military pact. They do not need to engage in some sort of development of entente, as we've seen from previous centuries, like in the 19th century of the concept of European realpolitik. They do not need to develop strategic alliance with the defense alliance, such as the transatlantic partnership. We will not see these kind of stages in the relationship. The relationship is built on 3 pillars, one being strictly non-Western. And I will go a step further, because non-Western in itself is not a bad terminology. It's not it's not a negative connotation. Most of the global South countries are non-Western in their DNA, in their understanding of the world, in the way how they want to shape the new world in terms of institutions, in terms of relationship between the countries, and in terms of actually ambitions for the world. But I will go a step further. They are not just non-Western. China and Russia, contrary to the most global South countries and contrary to the most BRICS countries, are actually anti-Western. They are anti-Western in their DNA, the way how they understand the world, which means that they have to create a credible geoeconomic, geopolitical, and geotechnological, because these are the 3 dimensions of great power politics and great power rivalry. So they have to create in all these 3 dimensions credible counterweight to the American power projection, which they consider being detrimental, not just to their national interests, but to the way they want to shape the world order in the future. The next important pillar next to it is, of course, this imminent fear that the world and the world affairs as they are, I mean, obviously being shaped to a great extent by the US power projection, are detrimental to the internal order in these countries, that there is an imminent risk that is emerging from the way how the world order is being shaped and is being more or less and is more or less functioning. So in that sense, both are organically coming together to create this credible counterweight, also in terms to their inner political and domestic stability. So this is the second pillar. So one is this kind of overlapping of understanding and set of interests when it comes to their own ambitions. And that is to create a modus operandi where they strategize and they converge and they help each other and create a kind of symbiosis. And I will explain also a little bit how this works. The second pillar being an credible counterweight to the American power projection, of course, not with the idea to destroy the world order, but actually to undermine the American-led world order, the rules-based order, the so-called rules-based order that all European leaders are so proud of. What it is in the core of it, what's at the core of it is actually US-led rules-based order that followed the end of the first Cold War. We are already in the second Cold War. I will explain also my framework for that. And of course, following the collapse of the one superpower, the other superpower imposed its own rules of the game, its understanding. It was the American set, based on the three pillars of liberal economic model, democratically governed societies, human rights and freedoms. This was the model that's been then spread around the world with the idea, not with the idea that the world order will be more peaceful. No, it was much more egoistic understanding, namely that democracies are just waging less wars against each other, not that democracies are waging. And I think this is a major misperception, especially on this side of the Atlantic, in the European side of the Atlantic, which presented to whole generations the wrong idea that democracies are peaceful and that they are actually bringing peace. No, democracies are not more peaceful than non-democracies. They're just they're tending to wage less wars against each other, and that was the whole approach of the democratic peace that that the Americans and the Europeans then started to spread around the world. And we know for a fact now, 3 decades forward, fast forward, that it not only backfired, but we ended up in the most precarious state of the global affairs with the highest number of military conflicts and wars around the world since the end of the Second World War and since the end of the Cold War. So once again, volatility is much higher than originally anticipated. So obviously, that is, of course, also one of the effects of this global system transformation. Now, going back to China and Russia, yes, they have very, very, very much overlapping understanding understanding what kind of world order they want to have. It should be ideally anti-Western. If it's not possible to be anti-Western, next most acceptable stage is to have a world that is non-Western. And of course, this goes to all the important layers, as we had one superpower which still carries the DNA, that was the Soviet Union. It still carries the DNA. How to spread this in terms of narration, in terms of ideology, in terms of, if you want, people to people, in terms of technology, in terms of socioeconomic networks, and in terms of networks. Now, when it comes to China, maybe final point.
I think Sunjoy wanted to say something. Just a moment. Fantastic analysis, Melina, and I want to ask you some more, but Sunjoy probably has to leave also. Is that right, Sanjoy? Sanjoy, sorry.
Thanks, Thomas. Yes, I have to leave, so I wanted to intervene on a couple of points. That was a great analysis by Melina. Thanks, Melina, for bringing out those points. I'd just like to add that, when you start talking about terms of reference like Western and you start talking of hegemony, I'm a bit uncomfortable with these classifications and the labels that we try to put on them. The whole idea of saying that there's a Western civilization and there's a non-Western civilization, I have problems with that approach because no civilization actually is frozen in amber. It is not something which stays the way it is. Everyone evolves, everyone moves. We take so much from each other in this world. And what we thought of as Western civilization, what Rubio in fact spoke about in Davos, the Western civilization as a great as a civilizational influence, civilizing influence across the world, and trying to cobble everyone together in Europe and America on the basis of let's get on with our civilizing mission. No, that is nonsense. That world does not exist. That world disappeared long ago. Again, about the idea of hegemony. What is a hegemon in this world? How much control does Trump actually have on the consequences of his actions? And we keep on seeing that again and again. Ultimately, you see that those actions lead to consequences which are just completely unpredictable, which he never even could have forecast himself. And then you see him actually withdrawing from those, stepping back, moving back. The problem of the US is different. You can keep on saying that, okay, maybe the next midterm election, Trump will be weakened and he will disappear, someone else will take his place, and this is the end, you're back to the old world order. You know you're not. You're not. No. Trump is a symptom. He's not the cause. There are deep reasons why someone like Trump has come into existence because, yes, the US democracy has got very fractured, has got very polarized. So, yes, Trump became a great binding force, won an election. But the underlying reasons why he's reached where he has and what he's done, the basic shift in the direction of US policy is not going to change. So US power is actually being challenged. It is not because, hegemony has run its course. It is because there are fundamental weaknesses in the operating system of the United States of America. And we speak about de-dollarization and everything else. The world does not want de-dollarization. To completely agree with Renato, none of us want de-dollarization. We're very happy and comfortable with the system. But the fact is that every action of the US which has happened, and not with Trump, it happened with Biden, by the way. Biden started using the SWIFT system against Russia. He broke the SWIFT system. He broke the interbanking system. That's where the doubt started arising. It was not Trump. Sanctions have been a lever of American policy for a very long time. India itself was under sanctions. All of us have gone through sanctions, whether they worked, whether they've not worked. But every act of sanction, every act of breaking the global financial system actually raises doubts about whether one can sustain a dollar hegemony. So people start withdrawing. So if this happens, it's going to be a slow and long, painful process, but it will happen not because of actions taken by BRICS, not because of actions taken by India or Brazil or anybody else, or by China or by Iran. It will happen largely because what the United States has been doing under its own compulsions in this process. So yes, we are in a complex world, and I would say that state capacity actually is extremely limited when you're moving into this world of technology, to understand the complexity of the world, to understand the interconnections, how supply chains are configured. And there are larger forces at work which are forcing actions, networks which are forcing actions in this global world, which ultimately have much more power beyond us. The direction they do not control. That is why we are not being able to write the next operating system. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjoy. That's very much in line also with how I'm thinking, which is based on my experience as an anthropologist, working in many countries and studying many cultures. And I have not come across a single one yet that has been able to live for any length of time without the rule of law. I mean, here in Australia, even, the indigenous people, to be a grown-up person, a man or a woman was meant to be a man of the law. That was their expression, to be a man of the law. And we cannot exist without a rules-based order. Obviously, the existing rules-based order always had a double standard. Carney admitted it in his World Economic Forum speech, and quite bravely. And that needs correction, but we do need an international order. And I'm going to quiz Donato on that in a minute. But one more question, though, I had for Velina. And thank you so much, Sanjoy, for your contribution. Velina, I wanted to ask you about Europe, because Europe seemed to be the big losers. You spoke about China's access to abundant energy from Russia. Europe had that some time ago before they swapped that dependence, as it was called. It was actually a pretty good deal at the time for a new dependence on US energy and also from the Middle East. And now they are in a really dire situation. Also, the Ukraine conflict, it seems to be that Europe has maneuvered itself in a position where it can no longer talk even to Russia, cannot have a conversation based on some kind of recognition that Russia has some legitimate security interests. It seems that it's a sort of a dead-end situation there, diplomatically. Though there are some voices now, the Belgian Prime Minister spoke about, oh, maybe we should talk to Russia. How do you see that, the position of Europe?
Again, first and foremost, it's up to your framework. What kind of framework are you using to actually explain to yourself what's happening around the world or what's happening in the global affairs? I argue that our European decision makers are not really understanding, first and foremost, that's a big problem. They have no adequate diagnosis for the global affairs. The global affairs are undergoing, and that's an objective, not subjective process. They are undergoing global system transformation. It might end up with something like a volatile multipolarity. I don't think so, but for the moment, this is, let's say, the majority. That's the narrative coming from the majority of analysts and experts and academia. I operate with a different framework for the last 15 years. My framework was one where the global system, because of its scope of interconnectedness, thanks to the globalization waves, has reached a point of interconnectedness where the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. That is why right now that's more important actually than the so-called rules-based order. Why? Because something that's happening in Iran might actually create a political revolution in some corner of the world, as in terms of cascading second, third, and fourth order of events. Now, going back to your question, and I had to open this important. I had to make this important clarification because I want you to understand what my modus operandi is, how I understand the world. Now, China and Russia, they are also, that's why coordinating, because they want a different order. And China cannot do it on your own. China cannot compete with the Americans in the field of geopolitics, in the field of geoeconomics, and in the field of geotechnology simultaneously on its own. Worst case scenario for China is actually geopolitical, not just geopolitical rapprochement between Russia and the United States, but actually inverted Nixon-Kissinger approach. Worst case scenario for the Americans is actually when this modus operandi turns into a next stage of, let's say, global power projection. And yes, I agree, global power projection doesn't have to happen in military terms. No, I agree with our Brazilian colleague. China doesn't have to wage wars. You can actually be a global hegemon just by being, for instance, trade partner number one of whole continents, like it's the case with China, which is meanwhile trade partner number one of the whole African continent. You see, things are important to understand when you have an adequate framework. Now, back to Europe. What's the framework that Europe is using right now? Europe has been the longer arm of the transatlantic partnership. It has been benefiting from one superpower competing with another. It has been benefiting from this superpower winning against actually the other superpower, and then it has decided that the end of history has come, and now we can actually focus on topics that are no longer relevant for realpolitik and for the use of military power, only to face the most comprehensive war on the old continent, which is now the Russian war against Ukraine in its 5th year, and to face another systemic crisis, which is now the ongoing war in Iran, not to speak of the Israeli-Hamas war that also created ripple effects for the whole European continent. And all in all, if you also use, so that I don't want to use only my own base scenarios, let's quote the bureaucrats. If you use the Draghi report, if you use the Letter report, if you use Macron's speeches, Europe is in a systemic and structural crisis. Once, because it hasn't reshaped its relationship with the Americans, there is a big rupture, internal rupture, which is ideological and political when it comes to the bilateral relationship. There is a big rupture when it comes to China, obviously. And then there is a big rupture when it comes to the European-Russian relationship. And because you directly asked me about the Russian-European relationship, now, as a geopolitical strategist, I am assuring you that sooner rather than later, there will be a phase where European leaders will have to talk to Russia once again. Why? For preventing any risk of direct military conflict between European NATO and Russia, because the Americans are withdrawing and because the Europeans haven't created credible deterrence against the Russians. The next thing that happens now, as they are trying to catch up in the credible deterrence, is to make sure if, let's say, my best scenario turns out to be correct for this year, which is ceasefire for this year in Ukraine, maybe around spring, end of spring, beginning of summer. Now with the new war, maybe this is going to be postponed to autumn, but for this year to have a ceasefire, that's been certainly within my base scenario. And for that to happen, there has to be also political dialogue between the European leaders and the Russians for the sake of preventing worst case, let's say, some sort of misjudgment, some sort of miscalculation, which could trigger direct military conflict between the Russians and the Europeans. This is where we are, but in a sense, I have no big expectations, if I'm honest with you. If I take a look at the statements of our European decision makers, if I take a look at their reactions to wars and to military conflicts, and the way how they are not able to tackle none of this, now they are, of course, hoping for the middle powers. They are hoping that they can actually catch up with middle powers like India, like Brazil, basically in every continent where they are potential partners, that they can catch up and they can compensate. But you cannot compensate. You cannot. We are not in the situation right now where the sum of the middle powers are able to prevent these wars from happening, so long as there is a triumvirate of great power competition on the other hand, that's more or less steering the world order into one or other direction. So this is what the Europeans are doing right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Velina. And I agree with what you said about multipolarity. It's really quite a useless terminology. The world has always been multipolar, let's face it. No one's ever completely dominated it. There's been, some of the poles have been dominant at times, but that's about it. There's no unipolarity, no such thing. And it's just a blunt analytical tool. You're quite right. I agree also what you said about the Europeans needing to have that conversation, because they might find they have more common interests than they've led themselves to believe with Russia and also indeed with China. And you're quite right about the approach to other middle powers like India, the free trade agreement with the EU, also Australia coming this week. Probably, and other steps in that direction, Canada, Mercosur, and so on. But I'm now going to ask Donato to give us his take on all this. And last not least, Donato, I'm very much looking forward to your perspective, because you're placed in Geneva at the UN. You hear a lot. I'm very curious to see what the mood is in the UN. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, we hear things like the UN considering cooperation with Trump's peace board, for example, things like that. We hear obviously protestations, that international law needs to be observed, the Geneva Convention needs to be uh, uh, obeyed. We have had various statements, certainly in the General Assembly. There's some kind of consensus. I think everybody would like to see this war end as quickly as possible. But what do you make of the multilateral system? It is the only one we have. Okay. Especially the SDGs are the only vision we have of a positive future for humanity. I'm still very much a believer in the UN, though I see the need for reform. But I would like to hear your views on all this and on the conflict and how the UN might deal with that. What potential there is for peace under UN leadership or in some other form, because you're also heading the new Global Peace Offensive within the World Academy, which is a positive way to approach all this. Over to you, Donato.
Thomas, Franz, thank you for your invitation, first of all. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Very well. You see, first of all, I am a former UN official, so long time, actually retired now, happily retired, and we work because we enjoy the exchanges. We enjoy to be occupied, usefully occupied, you and me, through the World Academy. But I do not obviously represent the views of the United Nations. But I can say that I have still my antennas somehow ready to capture the mood, if that's what you mean. But first of all, I want to say that from my standpoint, and this is the essence also of the initiative, the Global Peace Offensive, we have altogether a collective responsibility towards peace and security, making sure that we do leave something behind, I mean, to future generations. So this is not just a UN or a state-centered approach. Is something that we carry as our own responsibility to mend relations and to make sure that we have a different conception also of human relations. So this, I want to start from this point because I want to give you more of a background of the peace offensive later on. But again, are we there? Yes. The main important thing is to consider that it's not just states, it's not just state relations. The Westphalia system faded already for some time. Responsibilities are shared by individuals, first of all, by corporations, businesses, science, scientists, technology nowadays. So we have to make sure that these components of the society come to fruition when we talk about peace building, when we talk about making peace, we talk about peacekeeping in a general context. So, with this premise, yes, I agree with you, and I agree with the previous speakers that we are in a very delicate predicament, in a situation where we have a constant blurring of the lines in terms of legal standpoints, legal boundaries. There is a broad institutional decay that, of course, embraces also the United Nations with this erosion of norms that we all know about. And that hardly inspires confidence to people. I mean, what are you left with? If the United Nations system that was supposed to maintain peace and security for all is gradually fading, is irreversibly also fading, and perhaps, I mean, this is what I hope will not become, but it is poised to become irrelevant. In this moment, it is irrelevant in the major discourse of peace and security, and not just because the Security Council is paralyzed. Is because there is also an asymmetrical accountability among member states, and there is a widespread decay, as I was saying, and non-confidence by member states that even brings nowadays threats of like we thought were disappeared already for a long time, like piracy, for instance. You know, we have state-led piracy these days, where each actor undermines the other one. Nuclear weapons are still looming in the background, as you know, and we are back in this gunboat geopolitics with drones, with satellites, with nuclear weapons, and the war is waged in different ways, as we know, through tariffs, trade barriers, military action, etc. Is what do we have on the other side? We have this sort of attempt to negotiate or mediate through this real estate diplomacy. You know, the bargaining deal for based on profits that the new or the present U.S. administration is carrying out. What is surprising, in my views, Thomas, is that we are somehow commentators are somehow wondering about multilateralism, whether it is still in existence, and what can we do to revive it. It's true that multilateralism has been questioned, and someone said that before me, already for a long time. When we talk about the common good, you know, when we talk about the collective security system, this is not since this administration. This is a sort of bipartisan approach in the US, as we know. You know, I remember very well already in 1993, the Secretary of State Warren Christopher under Clinton stated that the US will never subcontract its foreign policy to another power or entity. And he added that collective security is supportable only when this coincides with American values and unilateral interests and leadership. So when all these are fused together as a common interest. Obviously, this has continued. It's not that we can say that things got worse. Under Bush, under Clinton, under Obama, there was the attempt to use the fig leaf of the UN Security Council resolutions to authorize military actions. That was, you remember, in Somalia in 1993. Then the US withdrew from the UN mission that were leading. They were actually leading on behalf of the United Nations system. So what happens nowadays is that the administration, U.S. administration, systematically bypasses the UN and the consensus-based machinery. So and here I refer also to the global South, obviously does not accept the Western stewardship any longer. So there is no reason why they should accept a politics, international politics, that are based only on improvisation, on pressure, and on intimidation. The most striking element of this is really the improvisation, the unpredictable element that characterizes the current state of affairs, Thomas, because that makes it impossible to deal with. I mean, you can have all sorts of scenario planning, you can have all sorts of, but the level of unpredictability of the present tenure of international affairs is really incredible, and there are no credible diplomatic horizons. The U.S. is apparently is no longer the policeman or should not be the policeman of the world, but still they want to maintain the for themselves the peacemaking of last resort approach. You know, they want to make the deal again. But what kind of deals? This is a matter of constant contradictions, you know, and that brings disorientation. The consequence of all this, and this I feel really is the real when we talk about distrust, when we talk about you know, tensions, or overwhelming tensions, or deep dive into the crisis. That's what it is. I mean, it's the fact that we have a crisis of identity that touches also upon the United Nations. That is, as we all know, a slow, process-oriented institution that was characterized by the multilateral consensus system based on legitimacy, on cooperation, on equal standing. But since diplomacy is neglected, obviously the UN also becomes irrelevant. So what is he doing now, right now, the United Nations? It still has a sphere of its own. You were mentioning the SDGs. I would say that humanitarian action is certainly an area where the UN is still providing relief, is still providing important assistance worldwide. There is the norm setting that still remains a critical function of the United Nations, and technical cooperation. But when it comes to the peacekeeping, the peacemaking, that is not right now something that is happening the way it should be. There is also an element of let's say, bias that has been used in many places, and where the United Nations officials themselves have passed the line and not used applied the principles of neutrality and impartiality that are essential to cultivate and to maintain a role in critical situations. So now, what is the situation? I think that peace is not something you can handle with a stroke of a pen. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a long process. It needs to be cultivated. You need to have new collaborative pathways for peace based on human relations, as I was saying to you, and well, we need really to bring back our sense of humanity and bring it back to the center of the discourse, the center of the ring. We heard, yes, state-based initiatives can be very helpful. We heard about the middle power initiatives. But I believe that if we do not relocate the decision-making system, if we don't bring it downwards towards the people, the individuals, the collectivity of individuals, we are not going to make peace. I mean, the approach that we need to change is really a new definition of the peace-building paradigm. I mean, the peace-building paradigm, again, is something that requires a long process. And now, since we are in a situation of total disruption, we have a sort of rare opportunity to reset these relations. The Global Peace Offensive, as you know, and I come to the second point, is an initiative of the World Academy that have been spearheading. Now we have more and more institutions are supporting it. It is a consolidated initiative towards peace, where there is an effort by a multitude of players that believe that we have to find a new system to negotiate, to bring to the table, or to the tables in general, our disagreements, and find a way to elevate also the discourse, finding solutions, concrete solutions. So what I always say is an initiative that is based on concrete solutions. solutions are not necessarily at hand, need to be studied, need to be evaluated, need to be assessed, and where you activate a positive circle also of appreciation towards also your opponents, because you are trying to find a middle ground, trying to find solutions through what? Through cultural initiatives, through scientific initiatives, where culture and science are the backbone actually of our own knowledge of who do we are, of what do we represent. So if we do not tap on that, on science and technology, on our cultures, on our identity as human beings, certainly we are not going to change the pattern. So the novelty here is that we also have developed a modality whereby you can use and compare findings and make sure that you have several initiatives at grassroots levels, but that they can, come one on top of the other one, and certainly in the end also have a certain impact in the different situations. We are testing our approach right now with the rollout. We had, as you know, a discussion. Probably you were in Baku, was one of the events of the World Academy. Simultaneously, I was in Maribor, where we had the rollout study of the peace offensive. So we are trying to get more institutions under the fold to make sure that we can have a people-to-people approach and not necessarily state level. So that's what
Donato,
I can say. My personal feeling is that although I worked all my life at the state level relations, we have really to bring it down to a certain level and also help emerging leaders, new leaders, youth in particular. You and I, we are very sympathetic towards this, the cause of youth. I mean, if we do not work to promoting positive peace and nurture mutual understanding, we are not able to de-escalate tensions. So basically,
thank you,
this is
Donato.
the simple recipe of the approach I'm promoting.
Thank you, Donato. That's a very important counterbalance to all the discussion we had on the balance of power, of economic power, monetary power, financial power, military power. But there's so much more to human relations than power. There is more to us than that. And I think what you said is a very powerful reminder that we need to remember our humanity and forget the rest, as somebody famous once said, and really think of peace as something that we're responsible for building and that we can do, and that it's work, and that it's if you want to be, a heroic, fight for peace, not war. Waging war is not heroic. It's very easy to turn towards aggression to try and achieve your aims. It's much more difficult to consider other people's, to rise over one's own self-interest as a person or as a nation. And you mentioned youth, and I'm going to ask Lorenzo has been wanting to ask Velina a question about South America. Lorenzo, of course, is in Venezuela, and Velina, I hope you're still there. Yeah. Okay, Lorenzo should.
Hi, thank you, Thomas.
But on should.
Well, Galina, as Thomas mentioned, I'm in Venezuela, so theoretically speaking, I'm in the eye of the storm, as it started this year. And I wanted to ask you about Latin America in particular. You know, at the beginning of this conversation, this webinar, we had an interesting discussion about multipolarity, the BRICS bloc, and so on and so forth, and different perspectives on what is happening right now. And in a certain way, Latin America is in the crossroads because we really didn't have too much attention from the US these last 10 years. And now we are getting probably too much attention. So different analysts are seeing this as a rapprochement to the idea of influence blocks that used to prevail before the start of World War I, and how the US is trying to tell China, you stay away from the Americas because it's ours, and we might give you more bandwidth to do whatever you want in Asia, but don't get too cocky for it. So, sorry, especially for this sort of language that is very colloquial. Uh, but in particular, I just want to know where Latin America fits on all this, because also Sanjoy was mentioning about this idea of Western, anti-Western, how this is not really representative, but at the same time it is. And Latin America, it's a subcontinent that we are Westerns without being really Western, and we do have very strong anti-Western sentiments, but at the same time, we are connected with our cultural heritage in ways that are not as antagonistic as Africa, to put in that way. Um, so I just wanted to know from your perspective and your systemic view, how can we get on top? Because as a strong Latin Americanist, I do not want to change one master for the other. I do not like the idea of obeying Moscow, Beijing, or Washington. I would like Latin America to decide its own fate.
Yes, Lorenzo, you are asking really the existential question, because most of the world is entailing also most of the states and most of the population. And here we are, in the end, everything is centered around a core of, global systemic rivalry, and there is no place to hide on the global arena. There is no corner of the world that's not going to be affected the one way or the other. Now, let me just introduce my two strategic sense on the matter, because if we start, covering Venezuela, there are so many layers, exactly as is the case with every other country that we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
And that is why I always make this very important clarification at the beginning, that I'm just offering the strategic option here. That's really the strategic calculus here. So the strategic calculus on Venezuela. First and foremost, from American point of view, Venezuela is ours when it comes to power projection, because it's a part of the Western Hemisphere. So we have to minimize. We are not going to be able to eradicate, but we are going to do anything at our disposal, including extraction operations, including the use of military means for the sake of national interests. And here we are going back to the other existential question. Middle powers are not eligible to use military means for the sake of their national interest, so long as it's not, it's affecting the national interests of a triumvirate of great power rivalry. When there are military conflicts between middle powers or between middle powers and third countries, that could be tolerated up to a certain extent. But when it's about United States or it's about China, buzzword militarization of South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan. And when it comes to Russia, this is a different level. So Venezuela, unfortunately, is part of, strategically seen, is part of this Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere is now the Monroe Doctrine, which is the old Monroe Doctrine, which means that anything that's happening in our own backyard is going to affect our national interest, and we are going to do anything at our disposal to inflict pain on you. Geoeconomic pain, geopolitical pain through military operations, geotechnological one through control of all, relevant technological tools. And Venezuela, even now with Chinese and Russian presence, because the Chinese and Russian presence hasn't been eradicated, on the opposite, it's still there. But the signal is this. Oil from Venezuela is going to be reintroduced to the global markets, because we are not going to allow shadow fleet operations in our backyards. Again, Panama Canal, for instance, but also Venezuela, for the sake of Russian interests or for the sake of Chinese geoeconomic interests. And this is what happened basically with Venezuela. And this is, by the way, what the Americans wanted to do also in Iran. But of course, they miscalculated significantly, because the scale of Iran is not the scale of Venezuela. So in that sense, of course, we are not having an extraction operation. We had in the first week in Iran decapitation operation. And this decapitation operation is now, meanwhile, in the fourth week of complete cascading effect throughout the whole, across all socioeconomic networks. So Venezuela, together with other countries, right now, I would argue Brazil is probably still holding this kind of, thanks to its left-leaning leadership, it's holding kind of the hub for, non-American power projection. But we clearly see Colombia, also what happened with the political situation there, Argentina, which is now strongly leaning towards the American orbit. So this bifurcation that's happening at the top of the system is now affecting also all continents, where countries and groups of countries are basically they have to navigate, and when they don't have the means to navigate because of size, because of exposure, geographic exposure, because of interdependencies, then they become they fall victim to the reality. And this is what happened with Venezuela. So basically, Venezuela fell victim, Maduro fell victim to its own ambitions, because he felt that he had the strong Russian and Chinese backing. By the way, also strong Iranian presence. Nobody in Europe is talking about this, how actually Iranian militia have been going on the streets and have been terrorizing people, Venezuelans who were actually protesting against Maduro. Maduro felt very strengthened by this backing and thought that he could actually develop territorial ambitions towards Guyana and towards the economic zone of Guyana. And basically, one of the main reasons why, which is also very much under-discussed, why this operation happened exactly at that time, was that, Guyana was at that time actually exporting as much oil as Venezuela. But Guyana was exporting to the global markets, and it was exporting to the North American market. Venezuela was not. And this oil was basically not part of the global oil markets, which of course, because of scarcity scenario, was also triggering a higher price. And these are the strategic calculus here. You have this push on both sides, and unfortunately, in this transition period, we will see more and more of this kind of dominoes. Now, maybe last point about the influence, about this split in 3 influence zones. I do not buy into this narrative, and I do not buy into this explanation of the World War being split into 3 influence zones. Why? Because I have never witnessed a hegemonic power, a state actor with global power projection that would deliberately succumb to the split of influence zones and would say, let's split the world in 3 zones, in 3 territorial zones, because I don't want to have it all. No, I argue America will try once again. America will go for Pax Americana 2.0. Will America succeed? Open question mark. And the Dragon Bear will try to create conditions for Pax Americana 2.0 to fail. So the Chinese, even though that I agree to a certain extent with our Brazilian colleague, are not going to go for this kind of military expansionism, as we've seen in the first New Cold War. They're going to go for Eurasian and Indo-Pacific expansionism, which is their natural terrain. And of course, Eurasian landmass is going to be controlled by the Chinese and by the Russians. And they are going to create alternative maritime and terrestrial corridors that are not supposed to be controlled by the Americans. Okay, so of course, there might be a situation and there might be a scenario where influence zones emerge, not as an ultimate strategic goal, but as a failure of a strategy, of a grand strategy. On behalf of the Americans right now, I argue if they want to prevent the world from going into abyss, from a complete, total collapse, they have to coordinate with the Chinese and the Russians. They have to come together. They have to come to terms and say it's enough. We cannot allow another proxy war and a third proxy war and a fourth proxy war, because this is what's happening. Everything is happening in the gray zone, so that they actually avoid direct confrontation by military force. And of course, a confrontation that might need might trigger a nuclear exchange reaction. That's why we have so much volatility in the gray zone, which happens to be a zone where you have 6.5 billion people, and most of the economies,
That's
and
right.
all of the developing
Yeah.
economies. So in that sense, yes, short term, there might be a scenario of zones of influence, and because of the need to coordinate, because they have to kind of calm down the markets and the global economy and the global threat. But in the long run, the mindset, it's us or them. And none of these kind of equations is eternal, none of it. That means that neither the dragon bear is eternal. These are not eternal friends. This is not supposed to happen forever. But the same goes, of course, for the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, the emerging other middle powers, because in the next 10, 15 years, we will have Latin American middle powers, which are already on par in terms of global economy. We will have South Asian middle powers, which are already on par. How are they going to develop, and how are they going to interact in this new equation of global power dynamics is a question mark. Again, we don't have any final outcomes. We have processes, and this is where we are right now. We have to understand the stage of the process.
Well, our hope, of course, is that humanity will actually grow up to the point of, realizing that we need to cooperate on certain existential risks that we, from the science perspective, we look at all this and think this is somewhere there, children in a sandpit fighting over toys. It's not mature behavior, and it's very difficult for us to watch this when we know all the other things that are impinging on us. One quick comment: Donato didn't have enough time before to say everything he wanted to, but he's going to have an article in our forthcoming newsletter which has the same geopolitical focus, and he'll be able to lay out his ideas a bit more. Jonathan has just joined us. Jonathan.
I'm so sorry. I was utterly jet lagged, and I just discombobulated. I've been on a speaking tour, and I've overslept. I really apologize.
That's okay. I thought it's early over there, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's not. It's just anyway, I'm healthy now, and I'm good, and I'm with you. And
Okay.
and obviously I support focusing on existential risks. I mean, what could be more basic?
Yeah. Jonathan, you didn't hear the entire conversation, of course, but we've been looking at the whole sort of strategic situation, the danger posed by the Iran conflict, but the broader issues of destabilization at the geopolitical level. And the question I wanted to ask you, as head of the Global Security Institute, and also as a member of the Bar Association, and you're a senior advisor on international politics, and with all your experience on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, how do you see the risk? How do you evaluate the risk? I mean, we've had all the loss of all the architecture of nuclear arms control. START was the last one to go. How do you see that the situation now without those safeguards? There seem to be no guardrails. We've had Russia mentioning the nuclear option in Ukraine in connection with the Ukraine conflict. You've heard others suggesting, that might happen, that Israel might feel so threatened that it might resort to that. We've had Iran the other day bombing right next to the nuclear installations of Israel as presumably a warning. So how well do you sleep at night as somebody who's deeply interested in nuclear
Well,
disarmament?
you just explained you just explained my situation. Russia, from the get-go in Ukraine, has been using the nuclear option if Russia had said, we reiterate what we have reiterated time and again in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty talks. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We're going to ensure that as we assert our rights to protect the minority population in Donetsk, we are not going to introduce nuclear weapons into the equation. And the NATO forces similarly said we will ensure that nuclear weapons not be entered into it. There would be a massive European presence in Ukraine and a massive American presence in Ukraine, and the war would be over. But Russia promptly put the nuclear issue on the table in violation of the accords that caused Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal. So this
Minsk,
isn't. So I'm not looking at it in terms of the crisis du jour of the moment, which is very severe, as you've articulated, but that when we talk about the guardrails falling off, that's what happens. The relationship between nations changes, and the predictability of behavior diminishes, and the risk dramatically increases. Before all of this, I was working with William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, to advance the creation of crisis centers to address when there's a crisis. There's no bilateral discussions between the United States and Russia at all. The most severe consequence of the guardrails coming off is summed up in a Roman axiom called pacta sunt servanda, upon which all international relations rest, which is promises must be kept, words must mean something. If words mean nothing, then bullets become verbs. And if nuclear weapons are considered legitimate bullets, we risk every day the end of humanity. So we are in an extremely hazardous moment. The United States, during the first committee debates, the first committee in the United Nations is still a place where countries signal their policies. The first committee deals with disarmament issues. It deals with the nuclear threat. It's a place where diplomats come and state how concerned they are and why they're concerned, and it's a place where communication takes place. And communication, to be meaningful, rests on trust and integrity. The words that states say must mean something. So the United States had the diplomat from the Conference on Disarmament, which is an ongoing institution that meets in Geneva. And it is exactly what it says. It's a place where the nations are supposed to negotiate disarmament pursuant to the UN Charter. And the US diplomat from that institution flew over, and she was the spokesperson for the US. And she said that the United States is committed to its Article 6 disarmament obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the only legal instrument still in existence in which the nuclear weapon states promise to negotiate the elimination of their weapons in exchange for the rest of the world not obtaining nuclear weapons. So she reiterated the US commitment to disarmament and quoted some statements by President Trump in support of that commitment. But when you sort of pull apart the curtain, you see that there isn't any team tasked with operationalizing that commitment, taking the steps that would get there, such as advancing entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, publicly publicly renouncing any need for any further nuclear testing, which is what most of the scientists have done in that field, as well as generals. We have seen in the United States, which has hitherto, with some degree of integrity, stated its commitment to reducing civilian casualties in the use of force. And the Strategic Command, which commands the nuclear arsenals, has had very, very smart lawyers involved in it who articulate principles of restraint. We haven't
Some of
used
which
them.
have been, some of whom have been sacked or removed. Yeah.
Not only have the grown-ups in the legal realm there been removed, but the entire team that was tasked with ensuring minimum civilian I mean, it's kind of preposterous and with modern, conventional weapons, but still the principle to reduce civilian casualties in the use of force, that division is gone. It's gone. It's just not there. And we hear things from the Secretary of War. He calls himself, but it is formally the Secretary of Defense. But he's called as the Secretary of War, which implicitly changes the framework of the institution. I remind everybody that one of the greatest achievements of our lifetime, never achieved before, was the condemnation of the institution of war. If you go back to the laws of war, there's laws going back to the Code of Hammurabi, laws of Manu, the restraints that Muhammad laid out, lots of articulations of the use of force in warfare. But the institution of warfare, per se, was never legally condemned. But here you have all the nations of the world in the UN Charter saying aggressive war is illegal. It's illegal. It can only be legalized by a Security Council resolution or in response to and defensive, which is not war, it's defense, or responding to an imminent threat, giving no
And
other recourse.
the key
And
word there is Joe Kent, I guess.
it is
Say no
imminent
more.
threat.
Yeah.
Imminent
Yeah.
threat. So that principle was obviously ignored by Russia when it invaded Crimea.
Yeah.
It was just frontal. In every other instance of the U.S. using force post the creation of the UN, legal explanations were given. Now, I disagreed with many of them. I thought that they were flawed arguments, like the argument of the invasion of Iraq. But
Yeah.
they did not disrespect the institution of law per se. They did not disrespect the principle. And the fact is that many of us have been working to strengthen the international legal tribunals so that words would mean a lot more because they would be enforceable. But big powers are not subject to the enforcement mechanisms of the system. And until very recently, they have at least paid the price of hypocrisy when they didn't abide by it. They at least said we accept the institution of international law. And these are our arguments. The United States has now entered into a war in which there's no definition of what, where, when, why. What does success look like? What is the goal? The intelligence community of the U.S. openly said there's no imminent threat. Negotiations were going on. So I got back to the principle I was laying out, which is that integrity, that words must mean something when nations speak. So there's some sense of stability. There's some sense of predictability. There's some sense of rationality. That's been set aside. Now we look at the people that have come into the policymaking in the United States, I watch it very carefully. Many of the new policymakers come from the AI world. A lot of them come from a company called Palantir. And AI will speed up decision making. And as we rely more on AI, we're going to privilege institutions that use that technology well, privilege people who use that technology well. And it is a technology that privileges decisive, conclusory, fast thinking. It speeds things up. Just simply, I'm making it really simple. But there have been dozens of instances in which human error and computer error have put us too close to the brink of ending civilization. 1983, all the computers that the Soviet Union had then were evidencing a full-scale American launch. And there was one person saved us all. I mean, people say Jesus saved the world, maybe, but I think that the doctrine of unconditional love is the ultimate refuge for salvation in every way. But we don't know, did he save the world? But we know that Stanislav Petrov, a colonel then in the Soviet Union, did not pass up the information that the computer showed a full-scale American launch to his superiors, because had he done so, they would have launched 11,000 nuclear warheads, and none of us would be here today. He saved the world, this one man. And he said that he did it because God told him he didn't want the world to end. And he was a computer engineer, and he didn't trust the information. And his superiors, he told me, didn't know whether to reward him for saving the world or punishing him for violating his protocols. But he said what bothered them more than anything was that he believed in God. In other words, they ignored the achievement that he did on behalf of all of us, and they put their ideology ahead when they analyzed his situation. There was a computer chip the United States had that was not that the first sunrise that came up when it was in a satellite to monitor the Soviets. The first sunrise, it looked like a missile launches. It was a mistake. But we went on high alert. They were ready to take off. The Triumphant and the Vanguard, a French and a British nuclear equipped submarines, banged into each other in the 21st century in the Atlantic Ocean. The odds of that happening are so outlandish, but yet it happened. Now, what if a Russian submarine banged into an American submarine in the middle of the Atlantic now, and communication broke down with one of them? We wouldn't know. In 1995, the Cold War is over. The Norwegians sent a satellite to do a weather study at the North Pole. They notified the Russians that they were launching this missile that would put a satellite up there to look. They told, because they knew that it would look like its early trajectory would look like it was going to go over Moscow, and if there was going to be a nuclear use, the first volley would be a high altitude explosion that would create an electromagnetic pulse that would fry the command and control of the adversary, as well as everyone's refrigerators, cars, internet, all goes down. And Boris Yeltsin was told that there was a launch that looked like it was a missile launch that was going to be over Moscow in a number of minutes. And he said he didn't worry because he knew Bill Clinton wouldn't do something so stupid, and he trusted him. It all boiled down to trust. It all still boils down to our trusting the core humanity and rationality of nine men running nuclear arsenals through their authority. And I'm going to finish of why I'm so profoundly concerned. When George Bush said that the United States was going to invade Iraq, and the people of Baghdad would come out in droves celebrating our invasion, I told my wife, "Nah, I don't think so. That's not going to happen." And when Putin said that Russia was going to invade Ukraine and the people of Kiev would celebrate with flowers and celebration, like my wife said, "Nah, I don't think so." Now, if you'd asked any cab driver in Baghdad or Kiev how the invading army would be treated, they would have said, probably with lead and blood. They would not be greeted with celebration. They would consolidate resistance, and people would be willing to give up their lives in that resistance. And that's precisely what happened. My point is that the heads of the countries with the largest nuclear arsenals, as well as the smaller ones, which are still enough to pretty much destroy civilization, are not as smart as cab drivers in Kiev or Baghdad to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So we have people flawed, like all of us, with far too much responsibility, power, and a lack of respect for the institutions that have been created and done humanity well to stop hasty thinking, hasty decisions, and mistakes. That's what the law is designed to do. The law is designed to say, you might want to do this, but you can't, because we've decided when we were reasonable and rational that we need to put guardrails on our behavior. And the law is not functioning internationally as it must. So we're in a very precarious situation. The public is largely unaware of it. And we even have serious publications like Foreign Affairs publishing articles suggesting that proliferation would be a good thing to have happen. Grasp that. That proliferation would be a public good. And that's not considered off the charts in serious intellectual circles, in policy circles. That's where we are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I can only end by citing something our colleague Barry Gill said in the chat. The old order is dying, and it's a quote. The new one is yet to be born. It is a time of monsters, or perhaps one should say gangsters. Certainly not. It doesn't seem that we have the right quality of leadership at the moment I don't see it happening.
Well, do you want to
Do
talk
you
about
see
some good
it?
things? Yeah, I see
Yeah,
some
go
good
on.
things.
Yeah.
I think that the efforts to bring India, the world's largest democracy, into an economic integration with the European Union will be transformative.
Yeah.
We're talking about we're talking about almost a third of the population of the world will be dramatically affected by that. And since they'll have to travel through the Middle East, it'll have a positive effect on the Middle East because wealth works, property, advancing property works. People like wealth, and that will be transformative because Europe doesn't have the huge labor force that India has. But remember, India has a middle class that's as large as the United States. It's a huge, there's over a billion, several hundred million people They have great universities, they have smart people, they have strong family institutions, and they're on a trajectory that's positive. And the influence of integrating the economic future of the European nations with India, that will be a huge shift, in my opinion. If you listen to the leadership that was expressed by the head of state of Canada in Davos, where he laid out. I was one of the founders of the Middle Powers Initiative, which for 15 years was following exactly that strategy of encouraging middle power countries, countries with relatively good records on human rights and democracy, that have forsworn nuclear weapons, to be a voice for stability on the planet, because they largely rely on norms and the rule of law. So that would be countries like Australia, Japan, Indonesia, even South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, Canada. These countries, middle power countries, are a very powerful force, and they are seeing the dangers more clearly than at least as clearly as I've articulated, and probably with greater clarity. So there are new coalitions emerging. I think it's incumbent on us to forcefully and very unapologetically lay out the universal values and principles that the new coalitions must adhere to. I would say that it's very important to challenge the notion that human rights are relative, that they're sovereign, that they come from the state. No one who's ever been tortured is going to tell you that human rights are relative. No one who's ever had their home taken away or been summarily incarcerated will say, oh, human rights are relative. They're different in China, the United States, or France. Human rights they come from our humanity. Principles like that, and then the moral principles behind them, our responsibility to future generations. We need a golden rule that says we must treat the lives and well-being of future generations as we want to be treated. We don't have a property right toward the regenerative processes of nature. Property means you can destroy something. You own a house, you can burn it down. We don't have a right to burn down the climate, the balance of the Gulf streams, the lungs of the planet, of the rainforests. These are the future. So I think that our discussion would, those of us who understand what's at stake, need to be encouraging political processes based on principles and values and morality that is needed. And I think that whenever there's turbulence, there's opportunity. People haven't all gone insane. People still have consciences. I remind you that April 5th is International Day of Conscience. People still have a conscience, and people are still offended by what we're talking about when they find the information. And political leaders, when they have grandchildren, they don't want to see the world end. We need to help them with the ideas that are needed to get out of the quagmire. Look, the nation state was created in the 17th century to address the madness of religious intolerance in Central Europe. Protestants and Catholics were willing to kill and die to get to heaven. And thoughtful people said, wait, these guys are they're just gonna keep doing it unless we figure out some way to separate them. And that's what the modern state was based on. How do we separate people? Today our problem is not how to separate people. Our problem is how do we get people to cooperate? But the point that I'm making is the institutions that were created in the 17th century, the Westphalia model of sovereignty, et cetera, has reached a point of instability, and new articulations of the universal values that make us human have to be part of the foundation of what must emerge from the chaos.
Yes, that's very, very true, Jonathan. It's very much what we stand for at the World Academy, those universal principles. And this is not a matter of idealism, it's a matter of survival. It's very practical. it's how people live together. Like I said earlier, we don't have any societies in history that lived for very long without the rule of law. It just is not possible.
And
We
and
need to
not
have,
complex societies, yeah. Well, I think that part of the nuclear equation has been taboo is very important, and taboo precedes the rule of law, but the moral taboo is very strong. I would be remiss when you mentioned the World Academy. There is an initiative within the World Academy that our colleague Donato has initiated, the Peace Offensive, which is very much along the lines of trying to address how do we take the offensive and articulating where we want to go and how we want to get there. That's really important.
Yeah, we did discuss that earlier. But we're way over time. Going to just hand over briefly to Anna Maria to close the webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really, really interesting and already touched my heart because, as you know, Thomas, a Ubuntu World Advocacy for Reconnect Humanity with his self and nature. And I see that Sanjoy, Donato, even Jonathan put a little bit emphasis on the humanity right now. It is the most important. And yeah, I'm really happy that we had all this conversation. And probably on 5 April, you said, I think people are already awake, but I just scare. So I think that we are in the transition of a big change that humanity never had in his existence, probably. And yeah, I'm looking forward for the new world, new world that will be beneficial for humanity and nature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to the listeners who stayed with us until the end. It's been a very long session. I hope to see you around for our next webinar. Lorenzo, please make sure you get the recording, which will be on YouTube in a few days.
Sure
Thank
thing,
you.
Doctor.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much for attending. Have a lovely